Well, hello, everybody. Cool. So I'm actually a solution consultant with New Relic. So I do have a bit of background here in Wellington. And the things that I used to talk about the most was Dev Perf Ops or Dev Perf all the things. So we had some good talks this morning. There's a lot of concepts that were mentioned that are quite familiar to how we're navigating complexity around New Relic. And we'll talk about some of that as well. But I think today we'll just focus on our story. So you'll hear about how we do things in New Relic, how we've navigated some of these areas, and hopefully give you some hacks. Not the same kind of hacks, like the hacking of systems, but just tips and pointers of what we've learned along the way. So just to get started, can I know who in the audience manages teams, enterprises, or runs their own show? A handful?
Quite a few.
Cool. And then folks in delivery teams, so devs, perf, test. All right, that's the majority of the room. Cool. Awesome. So we'll touch on things across both boundaries, so hopefully there'll be something for everybody. Starters, if we can get this thing to work. All right, maybe not. All right, the slides are not moving. Oh, there we go. Yeah, you can read that in 2 seconds, fine print. All right, so the way I see complexity is, again, because all of us work in different job functions or different divisions, different companies, there's a lot of catalysts that drive a lot of this, I'm gonna say complexity like 500 times. But it is kind of like it's multifaceted, and I kind of grouped it into 6 high-level areas. And so we're looking at applications. A lot of the talks today and a lot of the talks that you hear about would be focusing on the microservices or all these other micro everything, serverless everything within the application space. But then we also have complexities around our users. So everybody's impatient these days, everybody's mobile, they're distributed across the globe. The same thing with our development teams, right? Our teams are also pretty much distributed as well. So that adds to part of the complexity within the enterprise, the platform, right? A lot of the conversations today as well have been focusing around platforms and how we manage those, we build those, we monitor those, so on and so forth. And then data. So because New Relic is pretty data-centric, this is near and dear to us. So we pretty much ingest upwards of 2 billion events every minute. So we do have, so data is quite big for us in that aspect. And then we're looking at methodologies, right? I forgot to ask if anybody's doing the Spotify model. So this falls under that aspect. So teams are agile, teams are DevOpsing, teams are doing all those things. So that also, in part, is simplifying single units, but then adding complexity in the big picture within the enterprise. And then lastly, we're looking at communication, right? So we have disparate systems, how do they talk to each other? And then how do we as people within the organization communicate with each other? So some of what you'll hear from us today will cover all of these areas and then some. But then we're gonna kind of pretty much split it up into 3 major categories, right? So we're talking about people, how do we manage complexities around that? We'll talk about processes and what we're doing and what we continue to do around some of making life easier for ourselves, and then the technology hacks as well. So I'm gonna let Nick take over and give you deets about our story. That doesn't really work, yeah.
Cool. So, when I was preparing the content, I was like, should I read a bunch of papers and then distill them in some actionable insights and bring that information with me? So I started that way. And I read 20-odd papers. I was like, bad approach. I might as well just talk to our internal teams. And I approached the senior leadership at New Relic, who took the company from a few $1 million revenue in late 2009 And then today it's billions of dollars in terms of market cap. So I was like, it's not about New Relic, it's about any particular entrepreneur or a senior leader or even a manager. If they are to meet their OKRs and their objectives, they want to be able to hack all of those three areas and apply certain innovation in each and every aspect. So I started by talking to our senior leadership, and they basically told us, I'm not going to give you the keys to the kingdom. And then, obviously, that was a joke, and they gave me half an hour. So I asked them tons and tons of questions and kind of distilled them into what was done. So the typical things I heard across the papers and through those interview processes was you can copy and paste, right? So you could take the Spotify model in terms of how you want to do your team organization. You could take a particular technology stack and apply that with it because it's proven in terms of scale, stability, consistency, all of the above. There was a third thing I heard, which was really unique. Anyone recognizes the gentleman on the slides there? Anyone knows who they are? Stalin. Sorry? Stalin. Yeah, so definitely there's Stalin with the mustache. And there is Genrik Altschuler, who is potentially the most innovative person ever. And why I make that comment, Genrik used to work as a patent officer in Russia. And this was back in 1930s. Essentially what he did is he read through 200,000 patents, which was basically 0.5% of all the patents based on the total number of patents ever reported. And then he read another 200K patents. And he contacted Stalin. He basically told Stalin, bro, your approach is bad. Let me tell you how we can change Russia from inside out and apply some innovative techniques. He obviously didn't call him bro, otherwise he would have been sacked. He was sent to the labor camp as a result of that statement. And I'm going to connect this back into my interview processes. So what happened next is this was perfect for Genrik, because at the labor camp were all those scientists and engineers and manufacturers who came up with the patents. So he was like, perfect, now I can talk to them one-on-one. So what he did is he wanted to open up the possibilities of innovating from going from a lifetime worth of work into innovating in 15 minutes or even in days. And he built 40 different solution templates, and he outsourced it. He said, here you go, this is how you innovate. So luckily, he was able to make it back out of the camp, and then he went through 3 different phases. Our leadership at New Relic basically applied some of these techniques, and they shared 2 techniques with me. And they said that, initially our CEO was a chief coder, so he built a really big monolith around monitoring. And then he had to start hiring, he had to find the funds, he got busy with the other things, and he passed that monolith over to our team members. So what he did is, there were 2 techniques. The first one is called a subtraction technique, which means he removed himself from the situation and handed over the ecosystem to a new team. And the second thing he did is something called as the cropping technique, which means crop something out of its current location and then spread it around or find a new location for it. So in terms of the team, the way the teams were segmented at New Relic in the early days, they basically gathered in a room like this. At that point in time, there were 250-odd people. And they said, today you are known by 8 specific teams. Everyone kind of look at each other. It was a really large room, obviously. And you're allowed to go to you're allowed to switch sides. So if you're a browser agent developer, we're happy for you to join the platform team. And if you are the mobile application product manager, we're happy for you to go and work on the application collector agent project. And that sounded like a really scary way of going about the whole team segmenting and team organization, but it created a positive effect, which means now I no longer have to chase people because they really feel that they should be able to deliver better in a certain role for a certain team. So this actually yielded the foundation for how we scaled to a 1,000 people engineering organization. So the squad model and the agile from start technique was hardly there because there were not many companies to copy from in the late 2008s. In terms of what we refer to as disruption today, even though there were obviously heavyweights and traditional businesses that did amazingly well and still continue to do pretty well, as soon as the teams were kind of reconstructed, reorganized, the next thing that happened is we were obviously coding a lot faster, and there was a need to re-architect on the technology front, on the stack front. So what happened next is we hit our first scale limitation. And if you think about it, what stops you from rolling out more features? We saw a bunch of roadmaps today, and they had some really useful use cases that would be great if they got to the customers in the short run. So at New Relic, what happened is after our CEO wrote the initial Ruby monolith, and he thought that Ruby was going to be like Go or Node.js for that matter, and that didn't happen at that point in time. So he decided, I'm going to scale out and start building a lot of other agents. So we adopted Docker as an early reaction to that situation in 2011. Hardly known back then. And we also, again, gathered in a room, this time to firefight. And the limitation was mostly around being able to deliver all that scale. Diana mentioned the number, 2 billion events per minute, which is way larger than Google searches and Twitter tweets. So this time, a private consultant was brought into the picture. I don't know if it was a part of that TRIZ technique. The private consultant agreed, Jim Shore agreed, that he's going to stick with the teams until the scaling issues goes away, and then the teams can go back to innovating and delivering new capabilities. So as a part of that, a lot of the changes came about in terms of adopting internal strong observability strategy. And the other thing that happened is we adopted X as a code, everything as a code, basically. So as soon as a new service got rolled out, the dashboards and the alerting templates were already in place from day one, as soon as they get made available in production. And now I want to leave you with a few solid, actionable information on the technology management front. You built a beautiful product. There is a lot of attraction out there. A lot of people are downloading, consuming your service. But if you hit that scale barrier, you got to start thinking about an observability strategy in the sense that you firstly chop up your service in terms of systems. And once you do that, you're basically breaking down a monitoring service like an ingestion service, ingestion of metrics, distributed traces, events, if you follow the event-driven architecture that was discussed. You next obviously want to store all that ingestion data into event storage and metric storage. So that's the second blob in terms of the system that you need to monitor. And the third part is the most critical part, whereby a user sitting in front of the dashboards or waiting at the receiving end of the paging, they are expecting to receive the information as soon as it's available. So if I break that system down into 3 blobs, I'm now able to at least come up with some SLOs around what should be the KPIs for these services to deliver within a certain time period. So to give you one example each, collected data should make it into through the ingestion layer, which is one of the largest Kafka deployment on the planet, into the event store within 1 minute. And then once a user uses a dashboard or queries a dashboard based on a SQL-like query, they should get a result within 2 seconds. So these were the sort of objectives that were discovered. And then our alerting strategy didn't just happen, we gamified it. First thing, we built a really strong reliability model. So there is something called as, from the engineering discipline, failure modes effects analysis. So you make a list of all known incidents and all unknown incidents. You then rank them based on the potential severity they could create. And then based on all that scoring, you prioritize them, and all your templates on alerting and dashboarding should be based on that strategy. But then how do you get SRE teams or operations team to consume all this data? So that's where there was a simple 20 minutes gamification in various iterations, and we talked about SLIs. So service level indicators, those were the measurements we wanted to collect. And if there were gaps, we wanted to plug them. The second thing we did is we didn't just talk about technology. We started by saying, what's your SLI in terms of the salary you take home? How many times in a year do you need to buy your kids like presents? And things like those. In order to zoom out of the whole alerting concept, and then building a SLO-driven culture. So once we got to the SLO part, we basically started adding conditions to those particular SLIs that were distilled by a variety of different teams. And those teams, at a minimum, they are task-oriented. So they do they execute the same kind of role. They all code, they all monitor, they all automate, they all deliver capacity analysis, and they all know how to use chaos tools, all of that. So the beauty is there is a level playing field. Now, once we got to the SLO level, our alerting started to look exactly as per intended. And then we got into the SLA business, which is, even within our engineering organization, they rely on tons of different tools and third-party services. Why don't we hold them accountable on the SLAs they promised us, or the SLOs they promised us? There is also an example of an OKR, objectives and key results-based dashboard for our internal ticketing team. The intent there was to not just look at dashboards that have numbers, but to look at dashboards that show whether a situation is improving or getting worse with the baseline in place. So that way, if my intention is to reduce S1 or P1 tickets down from its most recent trend to a much smaller number, the OKR dashboard will tell me if that's the case. So it's not just staring at data, but it's staring at information that will result into action. That was a lot to take in terms of the technology part, the team part. I have a few short stories on the process and the structure part, because we're talking about fueling a company with agility from the ground up, and agility doesn't come with instability. In fact, both of those marry up very closely in order to formulate a process and a structure that supports a cloud-native organization. So what I did this time around is I asked around, how did the process change? And first thing I heard is from the leadership, what type of a company do you want to build? Not that this is the type of company we want for you. You choose the type of company you want. So that was a good reminder that you don't get to hear things like, we have always been doing things a certain way, and there is room for experimentation. So tomato mobbing, anyone knows what that is? That's a really cool concept. You basically chop up your day-to-day work in buckets of 25 minutes. You use the kitchen timer, Pomodoro. You set it to 25 minutes. Now, mobbing is a build on parallel programming. So you get together as a team, navigator, housekeeper, executioner, all of that, and you keep track of 25 minutes. Nobody is allowed to disturb you within those 25 minutes. They can't nudge you, unless if there is a production incident, in which case there was a desktop widget that notifies you, production incident, someone get out. So tomato mob experiment was initially a very different way of organizing your day. And the second thing that naturally happened from there is salami technique, which is chop up big tasks into slices of salami. And if the tasks are particularly difficult, you cut these holes in the cheese block. So if the tasks are very difficult and there is a lot of gray area, you approach it with the intention of not solving it, but testing. So this was something that was brought into the engineering side of the house. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I'll leave you with one more little story where the auto-escalation system that we initially built, which was a bot-based service that watches for incidents, it used to page the world whenever things used to break. So there's a VP of product, a NERF team member, the incident commander, and the emergency room manager used to get texted for a particular escalation. Initially, this auto-escalation system was built for 2 members and a lot smaller product. So it was a sloppy system, even though automated. We moved away from that, and we built something called as Hubble, which was a nerd bot based in Node.js on CoffeeScripts. And it behaves like human, but more like a conductor of alerts. So it tells you, you need to page someone if you haven't paged. It then tells you, have you done postmortem? It also asks you, this issue has been going for long, what's being done? So it's more like a reminder for how you manage your incidents. I think the bottom line in terms of the process hack was to move the decision-making down at the bottom tiers where the action is. And that is gold if you build that kind of culture where you don't have to go up the boxes and chain in order to get an approval for something, then you get things done faster. So, key takeaways?
That's a lot of cool stories, some of which I didn't even know myself, so I'm going to move this up here. Yeah, so I think over the years, as Nick said, like there's been a lot of, it's been quite a journey. There's been a lot of learnings. There's been a few changes that we've had to make along the way. So again, like I'm going to split it up into the 3 categories. We'll start with the people, right? So again, with the monolith and kind of like just revamping the way we're doing things. Now we're in that model where our developers are able to innovate from scratch, right? And that's the concept of distributed systems, because you want to build a good foundation that allows people to innovate. I was going to actually do like a check today and see what new technology has been released today, but I thought it would be too much to handle. But that's the reality of things, right? So how do you then get to understand whether or not you can do this? But then if you have a platform that allows you to be able to just go in and pick on the new technology and start innovating, I think that's great. And then also allowing your developers the flexibility to be able to do that, right? So in New Relic, we do that in some of the areas I've worked in as well. That happens quite a bit. And so I think that's really, really key in terms of like moving fast and being able to manage complexity. Sorry about that. And then, so one of the other concepts that is used quite widely is a task-oriented delivery. So I know oftentimes, like in teams, you have different job functions. This person does this thing and then ships it over to maybe test, and then it goes, just down the pipeline. So one of the areas of hiring, right? I understand that once somebody comes into New Relic, if you're a developer, you get put into rotation within your first 2 to 3 weeks, right? So you're learning the pains from the ground up. And then Nick talked about being able to just navigate across the different teams, right? So if you want to be able to go from one area to another and learn all these different skills, then you're able to actually take on any tasks within any of the job functions within a specific product team. And that's what quite efficiently. And it's also a matter of like reducing technical debt, right? So you have one developer, or maybe you have one tester and 5 developers, right? So there's going to be a bottleneck somewhere. But if everybody has the skills and the ability to be able to navigate across those functions, then it makes it easier across the board. And then the blameless culture. Like we hear this all the time, but it really, truly has to be blameless. Like how many times do we hear that, a whole data center crashed because somebody did something with code, right? But then I think part of it, as long as it's not malicious, I believe it's one of those things where, we have to feel safe to be able to innovate, to be able to just play around and run experiments and so on and so forth. Sounds pretty simple, but yeah, it kind of gets quite tough around that. And then, we talked a little bit about the job rotation. So now we talk about multi-dimensional teams or multifunctional teams. But with that whole learning of skills across the board, we have multi-dimensional humans, right? So I think that works really, really well, and that translates really greatly when we're talking about ownership. So do you really actually have ownership if you don't have permission to edit it, to make decisions around what's going to happen to your product? Absolutely not, right? So being able to make the decisions, you have to be able to have that accountability, right? And so being able to own that means that that the people within the teams and the people within the organizations have the skills and they have the dependencies and they're able to do all of the stuff and actually own that. And that, with distributed systems, right? So we're talking about you have 100 microservices out there. I like to say it's kind of like playing a game of whack-a-mole. So something happens there and you fix it and then it's moved somewhere else and so on and so forth. But if everybody takes ownership, if you're building something and you've had to work a rotation program from day one, you understand the pain that that's going to cause down the line. So you own that and you fix that from the get-go, or you build it right the first time. So that trick always works. Give your developers pages and see how quickly the code's going to improve. And so when we talk about technology, right, I just mentioned that every day there's something cool, something shiny out there. And if you're in that innovation mode, you kind of want to play with all that stuff. I know I do. But then how do you know what's going to be right for your application, what's going to be right for your enterprise, right? I say experiment, right? And so if you have the platform that's going to support that, then you're able to easily do that. And the best way to do that, if you being able to observe what's going to happen, being able to figure out the capacity of things early on, is the best way to actually figure out what's fit for purpose. And I think somebody mentioned something about hybrids of other hybrids. I think that's usually like almost a necessary evil, because if you're innovating, right, you can't be stuck on just the one piece, right? You got to be able to plug and play in a lot of different ways. And then we say you got to build for resilience and consistency, right? Nick talked about X for everything, Xcode, right? Just codify everything. We've made everything a micro something, right? So with code, you have that level of consistency that you know that if you have to redeploy a container, it's going to look exactly the same as the one that you just destroyed, and so on and so forth. I couldn't tell you how many horror stories, situations I've worked with customers where that wasn't the case, and the failover was not, like the other thing that was there before. So consistency, I think, is key, and the best way to do that is to have, observability as code, being able to actually see what's happening down the stream as you build it, being able to have your configuration settings managed locally. And we've seen demos today about how you can just easily just run a config setting and then change everything across your stack. So that's an easy way to actually be able to sustain that level of complexity without actually legitimately pulling your hair out. And then we say optimize for continuity. So continuity here is in the context of high availability, right? So it's the new and improved high availability, because when we're talking about distributed systems, right, it's cattle, not kittens, right? Everybody's heard that model before, right? So I think the way, there's a lot of SLAs that have been placed around high availability and so on and so forth. But in this model, how do we actually sustain that? We're looking for continuity. So what if we destroy containers every 5 minutes and we rebuild them, as long as there's continuity of service and there's no disruptions and so on and so forth. So being able to optimize for that. And Nick already touched on the alerting things. But one of the things that I want to point on this is if, you can notify or you can track things that are happening within production, but only alert on things that are, one, actionable, things that are impacting the business or the customer, and things that require a human to fix. If you can automate the process, do it, right? Because I think this whole culture of, I want to be up at 4 o'clock on Sunday fixing something that I actually did need to be doing is not fun for anybody anymore. All right, quickly, because we're running out of time. In terms of process, Nick pretty much touched on a lot of what I was going to talk about anyways. It's about trusting your people. So at New Relic, pretty much all of us are super admins, and I'll take that with a grain of salt, because super admin will mean something different to somebody else. So we do have controls that, I can't go in there and destroy the whole stack, but I have ability to be able to navigate across the systems, right? And that comes with a lot of responsibility and accountability, right? And then that takes us back to that whole ownership thing. So I don't think, if we didn't have that level of access, there's a lot of limitations across how we're going to be doing any of this. And then this one, it's one of those things that I think a lot of organizations kind of miss. It's a hit or miss. It's that nurturing of that talent, right? So my former boss would always say, there was this phrase, what if we train our people and they leave, right? So it's usually that, do we want to do that? And then the other question would be, what if we don't and they stay, right? So then that pretty much stops your innovation. It stops the growth. It stops all of this thing that we're trying to do from moving forward. So training, which way works in your environment is good. But if you allow for experimentation, then most of us, especially in the engineering space, you learn by actually doing, right? It's that whole, do I learn how to swim by reading a book? Probably not. It's easier to just get in there and kind of do the hacking thing. But then lastly, I just want to leave you guys with this, because this whole, just managing this complexity, it's going to be, an issue for years to come. But then, adapting to change and doing all of that, it's continuous. And we're continuously learning. We're continuously innovating. So it's just one of those things that, we get better as we go along. And then, just be accountable for everything that you put out there, from an individual perspective. Because if we start from within, then I think the rest of it is going to be easy. Cool. Well, I think we'll leave it at that, because we're getting yelled at over there. Questions?